Oh,
Happy Thursday, happy Friday Eve.
yes. I feel like I also want to say good morning and good afternoon. This is our second, I guess I could take it evening. This is our second webinar as well. The last time we spoke to you was just about a month ago. So we're going to be doing monthly conversations, Give the Success Achievers community. I also remember the farthest person, I believe, was in Botswana. We had a few people from Fort Worth, Texas, Botswana, Colorado, all over the place. So we'll see if we can beat Botswana this time around. Hello again. My name is Julien. This is Kiersten. We are
Hi.
the money editors of Success Magazine, and we're so happy to be talking to you guys again today for our second monthly webinar. We have a lot to try to cram into this conversation, and this is going to be a little bit more instructional and educational than some of our, actually, I shouldn't say some of, we've only done one, but it'll be a little bit more instructional than the last talk that we've had with you all. And so let's go ahead and jump right into it. As you might expect, we spend a lot of time talking about money, talking to each other about money, talking to others, and reading and learning about money, and naturally to identify quite a few trends in that process. And certainly one of the biggest trends is where a lot of the questions come in. Everyone wants to know about investing. That seems to be the dominant conversation starter, topic when it comes to this question of money.
Especially now, like with
Sure.
the pandemic and with 2020 being like the roller coaster of a ride that it was. There were a lot of new investments that were introduced to the market, the mainstream, I should say, from crypto to NFTs. This might be, foreign to a lot of you all, but investing was a huge topic, especially from so many of us were on the phone, and there were a lot of like new entrants and new apps that made investing very easy to people. And so we certainly see more investing questions now than we did maybe 2, 3 years ago.
Sure, sure. And a lot of the conversations tend to fall in very specific, not to say narrow categories. So most people are more concerned about retirement, making sure that they have enough for retirement. And as a result, most people are much more focused on their 401ks. If you work for a nonprofit, it might be a 403b, or they're also more so focused on IRA, individual. But we want to spend some time talking about a different account today, which is a brokerage account, which almost feels like what is it, the ugly duckling of investment accounts. It doesn't get a lot of attention, but it actually, should say specifically at this stage in our life, is the most important account. We're much more focused and interested in what's happening and how to construct our brokerage account. And so we want to spend some time talking a little bit about that. But before we do that, I want to mention just two other accounts, really, really briefly. So the first one, which a lot of people don't think of as an investment, but it is the HSA, Health Savings Account. Now, this is speaking on time. Basically, this is a type of account that comes with a high deductible health account where you can set aside tax, um, pre-tax money, pre-tax income. You can put that into an HSA, and you can choose to invest that money. That money grows tax-free, and then when you're ready to use it for qualified medical expenses, you're basically using pre-tax money, and really using pre-tax money that is grown, in addition to the principal that you invest. Very, very helpful if you can afford high deductible health. The second type of investment doesn't get nearly as much credit. There's a college savings account. These often go by the name 529. These are typically state specific. And so you may look like you have someone from Austin, Texas. Hello there. We'll be in Texas in a few months.
Yeah, we will.
You may have a few people who are from, let's say, oh, looks like we're getting some feedback on audio. Can everyone hear us well? Right, we're going to wait for some more feedback and keep going. But we were talking about 529. Just one second. think that may have helped. Can you get a thumbs up if you did?
I'll try to put on the microphone.
Can you-
Can
Is that better?
you hear it better?
Dave, hey, Unique, Rashawn, that's better. Right, looks like the success team said that's better. So we're going to hold for now. If we need to make a tweak, we'll do that using a microphone. Thank you so much. All right. All right. Let's breeze through it. So the 529 plan, that is a state-specific investment account typically used, or typically used, well, typically used for college investments, so that you can set aside money today that grows that you can use in the future for a child's college education or anyone's college education. But we also know that there's been some tweaks to that because the government wants to incentivize people to invest more. And so they've now allowed some people to use it for early childhood education, which is really, really helpful. Specifically for those of us who are parents that have children, and we know just how expensive the cost of education can be. So those are two accounts. But we want to make sure that we are focusing on what we really, really want to talk about, which is the brokerage account. And we're getting a little bit more feedback here. I'm going to ask the success team if we're good on audio. I'm sorry again for the hiccups, guys. It's not my voice.
Plug in the microphone.
Okay,
How's this?
I'm going to assume that that solved it. There, that is really super clear. Thank you so much, guys. We apologize, and we'll make a point to do that every time going forward. So thank you for everyone that's hung in there. But you didn't miss much because we really wanted to focus primarily on talking about the importance and the value of a brokerage account. And so I'm going to pass it to Kiersten, and she's going to walk us through why a brokerage account is so important.
All right. So when most people hear the word brokerage, they typically think of a real estate brokerage, but investment accounts are also called brokerage accounts. And basically these are post-tax accounts that allow you access to a variety of funds. So as Julien said, well, you might have missed it because the audio was so terrible, but as Julien said, tax advantaged accounts are all the rage among people who talk about money, primarily because they're tax advantaged. They come out of pre-tax dollars, which lowers the rate that you're of income tax. So it basically lowers your income tax anytime you participate in a tax advantaged account. But with brokerage accounts, we're talking about post-tax dollars. And because of that, I think that's one of the reasons why they are so underappreciated, simply because they're not tax advantage. And while tax advantages are great, they're kind of like finding out, you get free continental breakfast at a hotel. Tax advantages are a wonderful benefit. They are not the only benefit when you're talking about a wealth building plan. So with brokerage accounts, the biggest difference between a brokerage account and a taxable account the biggest difference between a brokerage account and a tax advantage account isn't actually the taxes. It's the purpose of the account. So when you're talking about a traditional retirement account, the purpose of that account is for long-term investing and retirement planning. So they're there to answer the question, what are you going to live off of when you're done working? And there are lots of incentives like the tax break and lots of penalties like an early withdrawal fee that keep that money sitting there until you're 59 and a half and can withdraw it. So that's the purpose count. With the brokerage, its only purpose is investing. It can be short-term, it can be long-term. And because of that, you have a lot of flexibility in terms of how much you can invest and when you can withdraw. So personally, and this is just my personal opinion, this is not official financial advice. Personally, I think retirement funds can be a great tool if you don't have any other options available to you. But if you have any hunch of an entrepreneurial bone in your body, like a lot of us in Success Achievers do, or maybe you're unsure about your career, maybe you started your career and you're thinking about a pivot and you just, you're not sure that you can retire off of your employer's 401k plan, I would highly recommend looking into opening a brokerage account that doesn't require you to lock up such a large amount of your wealth for so much of your life until you're older. So keep in mind that the financial conversations like this require a little bit of nuance. This isn't an either or conversation. You should absolutely take advantage of a traditional 401k or retirement plan up into an employer match if you have one. So if your employer is willing to match your investments, you should absolutely check that box and get that free money. But you can also invest in a brokerage account. What you do after you've hit the match of an employer retirement account is really up to you. And that's the point of today's conversation, is to discuss this brokerage account as another option for you.
Okay, so let's go through a couple of reasons why we think you should consider opening a brokerage account in a little bit more detail. So the first reason is, going back to what we said in the beginning of this talk, is most people are most familiar with 401ks and IRAs. And what we know about those is that there are limits to the amounts that you can actually contribute to them. And so as of 2021, a 401k plan maxes out at $19,500. That is the maximum amount. If you contribute more than that for whatever reason, you'll have to essentially withdraw that money and put it somewhere else. And so there's really no point in doing that. You are maxed or limited by the government to the amount of money that you can actually invest in those accounts. Similar with an IRA, the max that you can contribute this year is $6,000. If you're over 50, that number is $7,000. They allow you to try to catch up a little bit, assuming you're in a little bit of a race to make up for lost opportunities in previous years. Now, both of these accounts do tend to go up. The government does adjust these over time. So I remember the earliest that I can remember was when it was around $14,500. But every couple of years or so, they increase it by, let's say, $500 or $1,000. But a brokerage account is different. There is absolutely no limit to the amount that you can contribute to a brokerage account. Not at all, right? So you could argue that while there is a bit of a negative associated to it, meaning that you're not able to contribute pre-tax dollars. With a brokerage account, you're contributing post-tax dollars, and so taxes have already been taken out. But there's no limit to the amount that you can do it. So if you've already, let's say, contributed $19,500 into a 401k and $5,000 into an IRA, and you just so happen to be one of those high earners, or you happen to be a high earning individual, and you've got surplus funds, you don't have to spend it. And I say that only slightly jokingly, because I know so many people, and I was certainly one of those people at that point or at certain points in my career, where you earned enough and you felt like, wow, I've checked the box. Mentally and emotionally, you pat yourself on the back. You say, I've checked the box. You say, wow, I've maxed out my 401k. I am doing amazing. I don't have to invest anything more. And you're right, you don't have to, but you could. And that's really where a brokerage account comes in. This is not something that's tied to your employer. It's not something that could even be tied or needs to be tied to whoever it is that you have with your IRA account. You could have a completely separate brokerage account. I like to think of it as an investment account that I keep in my pocket, right? Because it's money that just as quickly as if you're somewhere and you decide to spend $10, $50, $100 because you saw some things on sale, your brokerage account is essentially the place where you would park that money to make a quick little investment, or you can build a strategy around how you're going to build your brokerage account over time. So that's a really, really big difference. And I think one of the things that we all need to consider when it comes to opening in a brokerage account, there is absolutely no limit to the amount that you can contribute at any given point in time.
Yes. The second reason you should consider a brokerage account is because of its seamless access. So for most accounts, you can log into an app or to your laptop or iPad and check on your account balances and make transactions just like you would with your normal bank. Whereas with a tax advantage account or a traditional retirement account, if you needed money, you'd have to fill out a form. You would have to process a withdrawal. There might be a fee. There are a few exceptions from the last year due to COVID where you can easily access your traditional retirement money. But for most of the time, it's a 10% penalty if you're withdrawing prior to retirement age. And again, this is an incentive to keep the money there and let it grow, but it's a real pain if you need the money prior to retirement. Whereas with a brokerage account, it comes in handy because you're only going to pay transaction fees on the sale if you need the money earlier. And that's typically a flat fee and not a percentage of your withdrawal amount, like with a traditional retirement account. And then there's also taxes on the gains, which vary. You might be hearing a lot about capital gains taxes through the news because it's a policy question that's coming up about whether wealthier people should be taxed more on capital gains. But for the majority of Americans, your long-term capital gains tax is lower than your standard income tax. So it's still a good deal. Even if you pull money out and you have to pay a capital gains tax on it, it's still cheaper than what you would pay if it was just a regular income tax. Similar to a retirement account, you can set up automatic withdrawals to your brokerage account. So you can set it up to leave your checking account, every other Friday. Or if your company has more advanced direct deposit, sometimes you can take the routing number and the account number straight from your brokerage account and have it come out of your check before it even hits your traditional checking account. So you could split your paycheck and say, 10% is going to go directly into a brokerage account, and then the other 90% will go into a checking account where I pay my bills and have my normal expenses. So again, this should only happen. This shouldn't only happen. I would recommend that this only happens after you've maxed out your employer match for a 401k and have a fully funded emergency fund. I wouldn't recommend kind of taking money off the top and putting it into an investment fund until you've taken advantage of those two sort of safety nets. When we were traditionally employed, we actually maxed out our full 401k for 5 years. And that's because our financial independence plan has 2 retirement accounts. So we are one of those people that use both a traditional retirement account and a brokerage account to fund our retirement. And I'll talk through that in just a second because I know that's confusing. But the way that we look at it is we fully funded our traditional retirement accounts because we wanted to front load and pay for our traditional retirement first. So that means we spent 5 years investing anywhere from $14,000 to $18,000 a piece in each of our 401ks. And our plan is to let that bulk of money sit there and compound for 30 years or so until we're at traditional retirement age. And then we have a separate account that will fund our early retirement. So our goal is to not have to work until we're 59 and a half. And so we have this separate account, which is our brokerage account, other cash producing assets that we invest in regularly. And we will use that to draw down income when we're no longer making income from our business. I'm going to pause there and see if there are any questions so far. Okay, doesn't look like it. Let's keep rolling.
All right. So there's been 2 reasons. One, there are no limits. I went straight there. If you get that joke, then you know. There are no limits to the amount that you can contribute to a brokerage account. The second that Kiersten just mentioned is the ability to access it seamlessly. The third reason I want to say or describe as the ability to adjust on the fly. So let's imagine a scenario for a second. Let's say you just have an investment account and you have, and by investment account, I mean a 401k account. And you have your funds there and you're watching the news and you see that it is just a dog day on Wall Street. Your funds or the Dow Jones, the S&P is all in the tank. There's really not much that you can do in that exact moment in time. And the reason for that is because most of our investment funds in traditional or tax-deferred accounts, assuming you're invested in mutual funds, there are really only 2 price points a day. When the market opens, ding, ding, ding. And when the market closes at the end of the day, ding, ding, ding. That's it. If I'm just going to make up a number, if it starts at 100 in the middle of the day, drops to, let's say 50. If it starts at 100 in the middle of the day, drops to 50 in the middle of the day, there's nothing that you can do in the middle of the day, right? You can make a decision in your investment account, which I would not advise you do. But if you were to do that at noon, it's really not going to record anything until the final prices are set on the value of the holdings that you have in that account. Whereas with a brokerage account, because this is money that you have the ability to invest in, let's say an ETF in that brokerage account, you can adjust on the fly. And so if things are going crazy, let's say with an individual stock that you have, right? If you have an individual stock in a brokerage account and you see that in the middle of the day that stock has boomed or has busted, you can lock in a gain or a loss right there, right? And so that is a really, really huge benefit that you can do in an investment account or a traditional account like a IRA or 401k, but you really wouldn't want to do that because that money is for your long-term nest egg. In theory, you've already accounted for these daily or even monthly or even annually ups and downs because you're not concerned with what happens today, next month, or next year when it comes to that money. When you're talking about your 401k or your IRA or any sort of tax-deferred long-term investment account, you're much more concerned with what you're investing in, the frequency of doing that over a long period of time, and ultimately what the long-term value of those holdings can be. A brokerage account is much more it can be long-term, but it can also be short-term. And that's what I mean when I say the ability to invest on the fly. It's a much more flexible account. In theory, you could have one brokerage account that supplements your long-term strategy, right? So you could have one that you also set aside and don't touch. And that is essentially an addendum to what you have in your 401k and your IRAs. And in addition to that, you could have a brokerage account that you use to make day-to-day a much more short-term, let's say 6 months, even next day or annual decisions. And so that is the way to kind of think about the differences between these different types of accounts. And one of the really huge benefits of a brokerage account compared to the other types of investment accounts that you have.
Yeah, I think you touched on a really important point before I move on to the last benefit. Which is that I think there's a misperception that when you are participating in a company's 401k program or retirement program, that you have full access to any stock or fund that's out there. And the reality is it's typically a very narrow list depending on who is sponsoring your 401k. And 401ks are notoriously known for having more expensive funds than what are available in the free market. And so there's a whole reason within a reason to switch to a brokerage or to add to a brokerage in your investment portfolio, because if there's something that you're interested in investing in and your company doesn't offer it within their 401k, you now have access to it.
That's a really good point because we get that feedback all the time. People may ask for a specific fund recommendation. They go to their employer-sponsored 401k and they say, well, I don't have that fund. That's far less likely to happen if you have a brokerage account, because in theory, assuming you're working with a reputable brokerage, which for the most part, the big ones are all reputable, they have access to either that exact fund, a wide variety of fund, or something that is exactly like it or achieves the same investment objectives. So great point.
We have one question from Lauren. Is it worth it to participate in a company 401k? I think the answer is generally yes. I think what the conversation is to what extent. There is sort of blunt force advice out there in personal finance that you should always max out your 401ks specifically for the tax benefits. And what we're trying to do is challenge that notion to say, maybe you should max it out for your tax benefits. It really depends on your tax bracket. But there are also alternatives depending on whether you need to withdraw the money early, whether you're interested in funds or stocks that aren't available to your corporate retirement fund, and whether or not you plan on retiring at a traditional age, or if you're, like us and want to retire early.
Looks like the supplemental question is here, maybe only participating up to the match amount. That's another highly recommended rule of thumb. And I would say in general, yes, but I think it also depends on the funds that are available, right? And so if you have a set of funds that really aren't good funds or are really expensive, which happens to no fault of anyone else, right? It could be something that you say, hey, I'm going to invest 4% because that is the minimum amount that your employer is going to match. And then you're going to take the rest of your income and invest in a brokerage account. That's perfectly fine. That totally makes sense. But I would say be mindful, or at least be aware of the funds that you're investing in as well. Because if you only have access to really, really poor performing funds or really expensive funds,
it eats away the match.
You may just be assuming that you're getting a benefit with this additional amount of money that your employer is adding to your contribution. But in the long term, it's probably being wiped away through the fees that you're paying, right?
Yep.
All right.
Last one is sort of how we frame up a brokerage fund in our house is we tend to think of it as an emergency investment fund. So again, there's certainly circumstances where you can pull money out of your traditional retirement account penalty free, but then there are others that just don't qualify. And so for us, we're, entrepreneurs, and, let's just use a hypothetical example where a friend comes to you with the deal of a lifetime. And it requires a investment. It requires a sum of money. And all you have available to you is your emergency fund, which has, 6 months of living expenses or whatever, you put in there. And your traditional retirement fund, which you're not supposed to touch until you're 59 and a half. And there's a fee if you do. And then you've got your checking account. Those are your only 3 options. And you're scrambling around, how to come up with this money for an investment.
By the way, when we say deal of a lifetime, we don't mean that sarcastically. We mean like an actual deal of a lifetime. They have struck gold. They've got an amazing opportunity to invest at a ground level of something that we know is going to be big. Not the deal of a lifetime that really isn't because they're just trying to get you to invest.
Right.
This is an actual deal of a lifetime. And you are interested, presumably, to want to invest. The question is, where does that money come from?
Yes. And the answer for us is our brokerage account. With our brokerage, we can very easily go into our options and sell some holdings or pull out from it. There's a number of freedoms that we have because we have this additional account that doesn't have a purpose like covering us in emergency or funding our life, from 60 up. So personal story here. Some of you know, we used to be real estate investors and had rental properties, and that was great, and we enjoyed our time. But once we switched to a more liquidatable, I think that's a word. It's a word now.
Liquid.
A more liquid investment. We found that we have a lot more freedom to consider things like bigger pieces of real estate or different types of real estate or startups or any sort of investment that sounds really interesting. We're actually looking at starting another business venture in the next, 6 months or so. And when we were thinking of planning it close to a year ago, we were talking about how we would fund it because it requires a significant investment up front. And so one of the things that we started doing was kind of taking money each month, each time we got an invoice paid or some money from our business, we would take a percentage of that and put it in a brokerage account for the purposes of funding this business. And that money has been growing for the last year, way faster than it would if it were in a traditional savings account or even a high yield savings account. Now, keep in mind, we knew that we had flexibility of when we needed this money. It isn't taking away from any of our other bills. If there was a loss, like we've obviously seen a gain on it, but if there had been a loss, we would have had a contingency plan and would not have, sold it at our loss. So it's just one way to think about, the investments that you want to make as you're thinking about your wealth building plan. If you're thinking about, possibly investing in commercial real estate, or maybe you want to save up a down payment for a rental property, putting money in a brokerage account, taking into consideration the risks that are associated with that move is one way to think about it.
All right. So those are 4 reasons why we think you should consider to open a brokerage account. I want to wrap up with a few final thoughts here. The first is just a few things to look out for, and those are fees. None of this is free, of course, right? And so we're certainly not crowning brokerage accounts the king or queen of all investment accounts. At this stage of our life, it is certainly the one that is most important and the one that we pay the most amount of attention to. But there are fees associated to that account as well. The good news is that typically only comes when you're actually selling a fund that is actually in your brokerage account. And so there's a lot of competition because there are a lot of financial institutions that want you to invest with them. And so we're not going to make any recommendations here, but it doesn't matter which one you want to work with. Most of them tend to offer the exact same thing. There are a few benefits here and there, and we'll talk about that. But for the most part, they all charge because this is a for-profit business. The difference is Unlike, let's say, making a withdrawal or selling stocks or funds in a traditional investment account like a 401k or an IRA, you're not going to get hit with like a government penalty or, let's say, a percentage of the total value that you have withdrawn. For example, if you withdraw $10,000 from your 401k, you're going to have to pay income tax on that money, and you're going to get hit with a 10% penalty. So there's a percentage of the total withdrawal amount. You don't really have that. You're really just going to pay transaction fees. And in some cases, in a brokerage account, if you're making a sale or buying something, rather, you're going to pay like a load fee. But for the most part, because the market is so competitive, one, these costs are really, really low. We're talking about $5 per transaction. And again, like very, very few cases you're going to see like a little bit more expensive than that. So that's something to think about. The other one is fractional shares. This is a huge, huge benefit, particularly for those who are a little cash strapped, but still want to invest, which I'm a huge fan of. And so fractional shares basically, or the ability to buy fractional shares, are typically a function that comes with a brokerage account. And the way that works is, let's say there's a share of a company that you want to buy, and the cost of that share is $1,000, but you only have $300. You have the ability to invest in that fund or in a fraction of that fund, typically through a brokerage account, right? And you can continue to chip away at it until you're able to own, let's say, a full share. And you can continue to do that time and time again. So fractional shares, or the ability to invest or buy fractional shares, are a huge, huge benefit. And I am certainly a big fan of that because it also helps you to build the habit of investing. And so if you only have $300 today, and maybe next week you only have $100, it doesn't stop you from being able to continue to invest. And I love that because you're building that muscle, no different than you waking up every single morning as a part of your routine. Shout out to Tristan to say, hey, I'm going to wake up, I'm going to do my morning meditation, and I'm going to invest a little bit, right? If that's something that you want to do, you typically have the ability to do that in a brokerage account, unlike what you would have with another type of account.
There's two questions before we close out. The first is from Vince.
Do you recommend sharing joint brokerage accounts if your partner has a different risk tolerance?
Ooh.
That's an easy one. No. I
was going to try and give you a compromise, Vince, but
I do not invest that. I recommend that. I think what you should do is have a separate brokerage account, right? Yeah. And so let's just say have one for the person who likes to play it safe, and then have another one for the person that likes to risk, that likes to, a little bit more riskier investments. Just do it that way. You can have them with the same banking institution, or you can have them with separate banking institutions. But there's not a lot of value in kind of making that unnecessarily messy. So I'd recommend not sharing them. Now, you might be able to provide both people access to it, but I would recommend just keeping it simple, having two separate brokerage accounts. You can have as many as you want. The second one is, do you think it's worth rolling an old 401k to a cryptocurrency funded Roth IRA? No, I do not. I would say if it's and I say that because the vast majority of people that I know, we don't know your personal situation, but the vast majority of people, in my humble opinion, are not in a position to invest something that was once meant for long-term investment into something as volatile as cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency, I think now is dare I say, in a much more mature state than it was, let's say,
some of the coins
a year ago.
Yeah.
But for the most part, we understand that cryptocurrencies are incredibly volatile. So think about this question, Shanae. Imagine you've got $200,000 in an investment account. If you put that into cryptocurrency, whether it's a cryptocurrency funded Roth IRA or any of those other benefits, it doesn't matter the type of account that it's in. If you put that into cryptocurrency, you have to accept that $200,000 has the potential to double overnight or completely disappear overnight. And in most cases, people who are
be stolen
because
with no reprieve.
You lost your password or something
or you
like
got
that.
Hacked.
These are things that happen in the cryptocurrency world. And so I wouldn't recommend that at all. That's not to suggest we don't recommend investing in cryptocurrency. I think it's safe to say that today there is a tiny space for that. And I think in general, when we look at the personal finance and investing media, for the most part, most people are awakening to the fact that, hey, this is a real opportunity. But in most cases, those are for the people who can afford to lose that money. And so I wouldn't recommend doing that at all. Final closing thoughts on a brokerage account are really just around habits, right? And so we are human beings, as if you can't tell, we're not cyborgs. But here's what I would say. If a friend of ours reached out tomorrow and said, hey, you want to go to Las Vegas, because we're all vaccinated. That's a very real example. Story, right? Let's go to Las Vegas because we're all vaccinated and it's been a while since we all hung out, and you had to find, let's say, $1,000 or $2,000. You probably wouldn't think twice about it. That's what I think a brokerage account does. It gives you the ability to make impulse investing choices. And so we've asked or spoke about it as a emergency investment account, but it doesn't always have to be an emergency. It can be an impulse investment account where you're just sitting around and let's say money that would have been set aside for something is now fully funded, and now you got an extra $100 or extra $500. There's very little that you can do if you've already maxed out an IRA, or if you've already maxed out a 401k, or there's very little that you can do if it's already post-tax dollars. There's really no other place to put it. And as a result, a lot of us feel like, hey, there's nothing better to do with that money than to spend it. And I'm not saying that we're not going to get into talking about the benefits of spending versus investing. This is a completely personal decision. But you at least want to have the mechanisms and the systems in place that allow you to make impulse and impromptu investment decisions. Mm-hmm. And that's really where a brokerage account comes into play. So without further delay, I don't believe we have any other questions, but thank you so much for joining us for our second talk. Keep in mind, we do monthly talks through the Success Achievers community. Ours will, of course, always be on a financial or financial related topic. This one is about brokerage accounts. You'll have to tune in to see what the next one is about a little bit closer.
And if there's topics you want us to talk about, please drop them in the comments on the replay in the Success Achievers community. We'd love to hear your feedback.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. Thank you for everyone that attended from around the world. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you next month.